All right. Ready. So first point, why do I wear a shirt? Because I look smart that way. And let's be honest, this is actually a shirt I had done to my measurement, so bespoke, in Thailand, in Bangkok, by a guy named Pinky, who did the white suit that I wore at Richard Zendaya's wedding. He did a bunch of shirts for me, exactly at my measurements. That means my lats actually fit in it, so that's actually quite nice, although I'm getting a bit thicker, so I think I have to get some more. But the point is I never get to wear them, so I figured 2 points, I get to wear them for the podcast, and I look smart, so everything is cool. Today I want to talk about actually a very important topic. The topic of stress and what stress is. I think this is, in a way, misunderstood. So I'm going to go at it from the optic of the nervous system so that we can establish a difference between acute stress and chronic stress. And why does it matter? So first of all, what is stress? Stress can, in a way, from a physiological requirement is what? If we want to define that word, it's just the demand for an expenditure of energy. Right? That's what stress would be. All right, but there is two types of spending energy for the system. There's energy spent toward the outside world, and energy spent toward the inner world, right? So there are a system in place for that. So what do I mean by that? For example, the bear is attacking. I need to spend energy fighting the bear. But once that's done, I have injuries, if I want, obviously. There's a number of injuries. Maybe I'm so exhausted that I've exhausted my body in the fight so much on top of the injuries, loss of blood, things like this, that I need to spend a lot of energy regenerating myself, healing process, making sure also that some processes, like for example, producing lactate, stays active and things like this. So first of all, glucose homeostasis is going to be a very important part, but I also need to pump hormones to keep maybe the heart rate beating faster, even though there is no physical component to it, in the sense of I am not currently moving fast, I'm on the ground trying to heal. My heartbeat will need to stay high in order to pump more blood, nutrients, oxygen, things like this. That's, for example, what adrenaline is going to do. So you can see that energy spent toward the outside or energy spent toward the inside is still a high level. So what does that matter? Because if we look at it from the peripheral nervous system, sympathetic, parasympathetic, what does that mean? I mean that sympathetic is energy spent toward the outside, the world, whereas the parasympathetic is energy toward the inside, the inner world. Does it matter? Yes, because many times the parasympathetic is explained as rest and digest. There is that notion that there is not much energy being spent toward the inner world. It's more like a restful state. That is, but conceptually it's wrong, because you can have a very violent inner world. Actually, the inner world is very violent in a sense, and then in that sense, there can be a huge amount of energy being spent. For example, even if we talk about digestion, you eat a lot of red meat. It's a huge amount of energy I'm going to have to spend to digest a large quantity of red meat. So just because it puts you into a state of drowsiness because for the simple reason that energy cannot be spent toward the outside, the outer world anymore, because most of the energy needs to be put toward digestion, which is an automatic system toward the enteric nervous system. It's using most of the energy, so it makes you drowsy for that reason. But that doesn't mean you don't have energy. On the contrary, you're spending a lot of energy digestion. You just don't have the energy available for other tasks. So now another nervous system, in that case the enteric nervous system, is in charge of that process. So you have less energy toward, for example, the sympathetic nervous system. So your senses will decrease in sharpness. Maybe your cognition will decrease a little bit, but in no way, shape, or form does that mean there is no energy being spent. On the contrary. So that becomes a very important division in that sense, to not see the parasympathetic as flow as in less energy, just energy spent differently. Right, that's going to matter. Why does it matter? Because if we look at stress, we have two types of stress. We have acute stress and we have chronic stress, and those are very different things. So what is the definition of acute stress? Acute stress is the world invading our safety. Right, that's when you fight the bear, that's when those things happen. So that's where the sympathetic is at its max. That would be, there she is, that's the acute stress. Chronic stress is what? Is defined as also a sympathetic reaction. But is that the case? For example, this is a debate that matters even if we look at a hormonal perspective. Let's look at noradrenaline versus adrenaline. So we know that noradrenaline is a neurotransmitter of the sympathetic nervous system. So that's simple. But then we associate adrenaline with the sympathetic nervous system as well. All right, but in the case of acute stress, right, which is the typical fight and flight response, if you remove the adrenal glands from someone, you still see an acute stress response just as valid, right? That's the entire post that I made about osteocalcin, right? Osteocalcin is the true hormone of the true stress hormone in that case, but in the case of the true fight hormone, right? So adrenaline and the fight mode have nothing to do one and the other. So what is adrenaline for then? If you look at the function of adrenaline, really what it's for is to keep the body going at a high rate, even when there's a complete moving away from the sympathetic. So if I explain like this, and then this is seen in almost all levels of the function of adrenaline. So you see that in the suppression of the sympathetic state, you have high levels of adrenaline so that, again, the body can keep on functioning at a high level, but with the suppression of the sympathetic state. So what does that spell? That spells that adrenaline is actually responsible for producing large amount of energy toward the inner world. So that would put adrenaline on the parasympathetic side of things, right? Toward the freeze mode. Once the flight has subsided, then you still need a high level of energy being put on in an autonomic way, which means outside of conscious control. So that would put adrenaline toward the parasympathetic side of things and not on the sympathetic side of things. So why does it matter with stress? So that means stress, something can be stress caused demand of energy being spent, expenditure of energy, but that can be then therefore toward the outside world, or energy spent toward the inside world. So, and there's an issue because, for example, noradrenaline are called stress hormone, catecholamines. But that means that one is a stress hormone that is responsible toward the sympathetic nervous system, whereas the other one is a stress hormone that goes toward the parasympathetic nervous system. So that means that we cannot associate stress hormones and parasympathetic or sympathetic, which I see all the time. So that becomes tricky. So what I'm offering really is to redefine the action of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. So in that case of what acute stress versus chronic stress. Acute stress is obviously the fight mode. That we see that with osteocalcin and things like this. So, but we see adrenaline being linked to chronic stress. Right, so that brings the question, chronic stress, is that on the sympathetic side or the parasympathetic side? What do we see with chronic stress? We see cortisol level, we see adrenaline level being pumped, and things like this. So it seems to me that chronic stress is more on the parasympathetic side than it is on the sympathetic side. Maybe chronic stress comes out because the acute stress was prolonged so much, we leave the fight and flight and we start to go toward the freeze mode, which would explain why we see the adrenaline at that point. You see where I'm going with this? That would mean that chronic stress, again, is on the parasympathetic side of things. That means that the way out of chronic stress would be going through acute stress, not more parasympathetic. So what if we do breath work for chronic stress? Then we would not be helping. Although it depends the type of breath work that you do. Because obviously there's breath work that can be done toward the parasympathetic, breath work toward the sympathetic. So you see why that distinction is so necessary? Because most of the time where we see with breath work is going toward the parasympathetic side of the equation. And the reason they say that is to limit chronic stress, because they assume chronic stress is in the sympathetic side. But to me, it seems that chronic stress belongs on the parasympathetic side. So that means that breath work that only promotes the PNS would actually not help. So, for example, you're going to say, well, but what about Wim Hof? Aha, but there's a difference. Most of Wim Hof's work on breath work is done in an ice bath. And an ice bath is an acute stress, obviously. Anybody who's done it will know what I'm talking about. You go into the ice bath, it's an acute stress. What you're going to try to do is control the acute stress through breath work. You're going to activate the parasympathetic, but with an acute stress response, so a sympathetic response. So what you're doing is you're promoting the flow with a fight mode that goes up. And that's where things start to go well, is when you promote flow with fight, so which is an arch I built. The problem is if you don't have that acute stress, right, and you just promote the PNS, what you're going to get is freeze. So we have to understand that, and that's the complication with the nervous system, is that sometimes they work separately, sometimes they work together, sometimes they work against each other. What do I mean? For example, socialization. As Freud said, the first man to throw an insult instead of a stone created society. That means that for us to live in society, I need to put a brake on the fight mode. We know that the brake is the ventral vagus nerve that acts as a brake on the sympathetic response. For example, that would be one acting against the other. When do they work together? For example, in a case of a Wim Hof, when we have acute stress on one side, flow response through breath work on the other, and then we get a greater system. But sometimes they work separately. And this is where I started to go, is I think when the parasympathetic works by itself, we see a freeze response, where, for example, adrenaline comes in, things like this. A sympathetic that works only by itself eventually would lead to a panic attack. That is more the flight mode. And I think when it works together, this is when we see the flow and the fight. And that's where everything works correctly. For example, if I have a fight, I need coordination. There's a moment, I'm in a fight mode, osteocalcin goes up. The osteocalcin dosage dependently eventually will stop the release of acetylcholine, which is a neurotransmitter on the parasympathetic side, which means it will block coordination. So I could see that if I had a fight response that is too high, I would start to get a greater expenditure of energy at the expense of coordination. In a fight, I don't want that. I cannot have that. So everything is an arch between the PNS and the SNS if I want to have not maximum output, but the best output possible. So quality versus quantity, right? So I think chronic stress is actually the drive toward the parasympathetic without equal response from the fight mode. So that means that if I'm right, that would mean that the way to fight chronic stress would be to create an acute stress response, but with the correct flow response matching the acute stress response. So I think if we were to do passive PNS work, for example, breath work without the ice bath, we would not help with chronic stress. We would help for a short period of time, but people would always fall back into the same problem. So it would help calm your head, but it will not calm your body. In the sense of that would not be the best way to fight, for example, inflammation or adrenaline issues or things like this. What we saw, because again, that's what depression is, right? Depression is dorsal vagus nerve, is a freeze mode. That the way out of depression is not more parasympathetic work. If you're depressed and you do Disney December, if you know what that is, you should know what that is, you'll see that you'll crash yourself more. The way out of depression is going through the fight mode. The osteocalcin, noradrenaline, lactate triumvirate. So this is where I think it's very important that we start to define properly what stress is, what the stress hormones are, and the action of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, because then it will help us understand how to use them better. So to me, a chronic stress, and there's a link between chronic stress and depression, because I think they belong on the same side. They belong on the freeze mode. And the way out of that is the fight mode. Again, what we will see in the Wim Hof work of breath work within an ice bath. Right? So that means that idea of trying to lessen acute stress to get rid of chronic stress is doomed. I see people all the time telling me, yeah, but look at everyday life. We are bombarded by stress. Are we? When was the last time you fought over anything? Physical fight. When was the last time you got hurt physically? If you don't do jiu-jitsu or kickboxing or stuff like that. But even that is a controlled environment. When was the last time you had a true acute stress, which means you were at risk? Car accident? Something like this? Well, even bungee jumping, you're still under control. You don't have the feedback from the body of the consequences of that action, right? You don't get beat up that much from bungee jumping. Like imagine if you did bungee jumping but had like bones almost breaking. That would be a true response to a true acute stress. But so we don't hunt for food. We are never hot, not that hot, not that cold. We don't compete physically for things anymore. When was the last time you truly paid a price for a mistake? So that idea that we are constantly bombarded by stress is not accurate. It's not untrue, but it's not accurate because, again, stress is just a demand for expenditure of energy. So it is true that you have a lot of things in life that ask you to expend energy. You are at the office 8 to 10 hours, so you're working a lot. But so now what we're confusing, because of the way of semantics and using words, is that when you're saying like we're bombarded by stress, is we are bombarded by demand of expenditure of energy. Right, so what you're saying is that chronic stress is being tired. Right, and you say being tired, that means we have to have less stress in our lives. No, we have to handle it better. It's always the same. So then in that case, chronic stress is bad time management in the sense of like your work is asking you to work 10, 12 hours a day, something the body is not well designed for. But you're not truly working. You're just spending energy on confrontation at work, maybe on emails or stuff like that. But it's not to be seen as the same thing as an acute stress that requires high demands of energy directly on the body. Right, so having to spend the energy mentally to work or to do something is not the same thing as an acute stress that requires physical demands on the body directly. What is the difference? There's a feedback loop there. If you just have the prediction of a stress, of a demand of energy at work or stuff like that, but you don't actually get into a fight, that means that you get the prediction going, but not the observation. You do not close the loop because of the lack of observation from the body that there was a fight. And that is done through, for example, as we saw, through the bones, through the osteocalcin. So public speaking will cause an osteocalcin raise of that hormone at first, but as the people have done it, no. Public speaking at first is terrorizing, but after a while you start to get used to it. And so if you have, for example, me, I've done the seminars with 20, 30 people for years. I get to that stage, I don't get stressed out anymore. Why? Because that stress was not associated with the observation of my body getting pummeled in the action. So that means that I don't need to keep that super high stress feeling of high demand of energy anymore because I know what I'm going to say in front of people. I'm chill. If every time I had a seminar, I would wake up with with like I've done 1,000-pound yoke carry, I would still have to spend the same amount of energy within the seminar. So everything is an adjustment between production and observation, right? So that feedback loop from the bones is very necessary to keep the proper reaction to acute stress. So going back to my point, when was the last time your bones told you there was a stress happening in your life? Your shoes are soft, your chairs are soft, your life is soft. So the only stress is coming from the prediction part of things. It's not coming from the observation part of things. The loop is not closed. So you're not having a proper stress response. And that's why you're more toward the freeze mode, and that's why we see the adrenal glands being overly used, and that's what they call adrenal gland fatigue and everything, is you're just in freeze. That's all, right? It is not true to state that we are bombarded by stress every day. It's technically true, but it's not true in the sense of acute stress. And so for what we saw, the only way out of chronic stress will be to learn the fight mode, to learn a true response from the body, not just from the prediction stem, but from the body. And that requires the impact on the bones, like I talked about in other podcasts. So we need to fundamentally reshape our notion of stress hormones, and how the nervous system works if we want to be able to deal with things like chronic stress and things of that level, right? And so that's the work we're doing at Strong Fit, and then I'll have a number of podcasts on each subject. But that's really a very fundamental idea that I believe is very necessary for people to understand. Thank you, guys.